I do, I'm often called an idealist. People look at me and they say, "So, you want to change the world?" Well, actually, I don't think that we need to change the world at all. I think that the world is perfect as it is. I think that what we need to change is how we treat the world, our attitudes towards the world.
My name is Lee White, and I live here. When we consider the state of the world, economic collapse, climate change, species depletion, food crises, acts of genocide, terrorism, and war, and the increasing disparities between those who have and those who don't, it's daunting.
We live in a globalized world where corporations are getting more and more influence and have more reach than governments, which are in many cases bound to their national borders.
I truly believe now that enough people can see through the illusionary way which banks can and legally do conjure into existence money out of thin air.
There are many puzzles and mysteries in the mechanisms of aging. Equally puzzling is why the fight against aging is not on the world's agenda. Are just a few people interested in why we're aging?
Critics of aid, such as Dambisa Moyo, have accurately and truthfully pointed out that we have sent billions and billions of our tax dollars to the developing world, and much of it has just disappeared. It's also true that when you are just dumping money from a rich country to a poor country, you can create dependence. These are problems with aid, but it's also true, as people like Dr. Jeffrey Sachs have accurately pointed out, targeting specific problems can create a huge impact that help break the cycle of poverty.
I believe in non-violent struggling, in fighting against wars in this world, in fighting against human rights violations.
3 million girls a year are cut forcibly. FGM happens because women are disempowered. They deserve to reach their potential. They deserve access to education, autonomy over their own bodies.
We are portrayed as a world where you have the North with ideas, with technologies, with capital, and the South is portrayed as this land of lack of opportunity, corruption, and problems. And if that were the case, then the only thing we need to do is to transfer money and resources from the North to the South. And we know that is not the pathway that we need to follow.
If we want to survive as a species, folks, we've got to act together as a species. Thank you for your attention.
Well, I'd like to welcome you here. My name is Nicholas Kristof. I'm a columnist from the New York Times. And this is an unusual session in a couple of ways. But first of all, I want to kind of give a bit of a PG warning. And the reason is that we realized as we walked in that the topic, it says design your cause. And so I think some of you may be here to figure out how to design your own cause or promote it. And this emerged because Julia, Lalla-Maharjh, designed her cause, which happened to be female genital mutilation. So as a result, this panel is about a discussion of where we go and how we deal with female genital mutilation. And we didn't want to have a lot of people wincing in the audience if you were expecting a discussion about how one goes about designing your cause. So fair warning. Of course, this is unusual in that respect, that we associate Davos with turgid discussions of interest rates and Middle East policy and whatever, not particularly about genital cutting. The other way in which this is most unusual is that this topic arose from a YouTube audience. And we've talked all the time about the importance of social media, how we can build campaigns. Well, this is an embodiment of precisely that. And if you are here in the room, of course, please turn off your cell phones. If you are at home watching on YouTube, then turn on your cell phones really loudly and just hit pause. As I said, this topic arose because people on YouTube were invited to vote among some competing ideas, some competing causes. And Julia Lalla-Maharjh, you want to raise your hand there? Julia submitted a video which explains her passion, her cause, and let's cut to that now.
Last year, I volunteered in Ethiopia, and one of the things I saw there, female genital mutilation, has completely changed the path of my life. I realized I couldn't look away from this urgent issue. So I came back to London and volunteered with an organisation. And a friend sent me a link to the YouTube debates saying someone with an urgent human rights cause had to go to Davos. And I thought, this has got to be it. So why send me to Davos? Because I want to ask those innovative and intrepid world leaders to put their hearts and minds and power behind ending FGM. I've just found out that I am going to Davos. Since I won, I've been doing a video diary every day and really just trying to raise awareness about the basics of this very complex issue. So what is FGM? It's very simply the removal of a girl's external genitals, the clitoris, the labia, and in severe cases, the wound that's left is sewn up, so there's only a tiny hole left.
I'm just pleased the day is here, actually, because there's been a lot of prep to get to this point.
It's night one in Davos, and as you can see, it's absolutely beautiful.
My belief is that issues like this can't stay on the margins, that they really have to be debated at the highest levels.
I'll follow up. Bless you.
I'm really delighted I entered this competition. Who would have thought 10 days later I would go from my kitchen table to Davos? But let's not be complacent. This is just a few days at Davos. There's so much more to be done. There are still 3 million girls a year being cut. So what can we do together today to help do something about this?
Well, hats off to Julia on that, and fair warning, as you can see, she may well buttonhole you in the room and try to get you to join the movement. I also think it's really quite extraordinary that, considering all the causes out there, that the YouTube audience, a large audience, chose this one as the foremost issue that they wanted to address. And I think, in a larger sense, it does reflect the degree to which the rights of women and girls around the world are rising on the agenda. Julia, I wonder if we could just start off by maybe just addressing this question of, given all the concerns that we have around the world, whether on the human rights front or on the environmental front, economic front, why do you think this one is the one that should rise to the top, and why indeed did the YouTube generation, which is maybe more your generation than mine, alas, sign up for it?
I think it just really caught people's hearts and minds. And actually, it has languished in that box that we all tick that says, this is too difficult. This is a taboo area. This is something that we didn't know about. And as a result, I think just coming out and saying 3 million girls a year are still being cut, people just caught on to that. And a lot of the comments on YouTube actually said, we didn't realize this still happened. And I think just bringing it out in that way. And also, what was wonderful was people could go very instantly and look at clips about FGM in far more detail. So using social media in that way, actually allowing people to inform themselves about what the issue was, I think, just created this tidal wave of interest.
We have a terrific panel, and indeed a lot of questions that have been submitted by YouTube viewers, and we'll also invite your comments and questions as well. Here on my left beside me is Kathy Calvin, who's the head of the UN Foundation, which has been very involved in this issue. Beside her, Larry Cox, who is the head of Amnesty International, the executive director of Amnesty, which has likewise been involved in this as a central human rights issue. And Anne Veneman, the executive director of UNICEF, which has both gathered the data on this, the 3 million figure annually in Africa alone, figure that Julia cited, and has also been very active in supporting one of the ventures in Senegal, Tostan, that has been most effective in really seeing progress against this. But Kathy, let me maybe start with you. Is indeed one of the problems that this does feel like a taboo topic, that, it always seems to me that AIDS, so many more millions of people died of AIDS because it involved sex, and it was hard to talk about. Is the problem here that it involves genitals, and so it's something that it's very hard to have a serious conversation about?
I actually think it's not a hard subject to have a conversation about, and that Julia said the right thing. I don't think people really understand that it still exists. It's sort of is one of those things that we heard about in our childhood, and we don't hear enough about it today. So my hat is off to Julia for bringing this back up front and center. I think the other reason we don't hear as much about it is it's about girls, and we don't really have an understanding of the life of 600 million girls around the world, that they don't get to stay in school, they get married off early, they're subject to genital mutilation. Their lives are challenging in ways that American girls don't really understand. And when they hear about it, they're shocked, they think it's unfair, and they want to do something. So yes, there's probably something about, now how do we talk about this? I frankly think reproductive health is just as difficult to talk about, especially when it comes to girls. But increasingly people, I heard Melinda Gates yesterday speaking out about it, it's time to deal with these issues. And so here we are.
Larry, I had a conversation once with a Sudanese Daya, a woman who does the cutting, and I pushed her on genital cutting, and she said, "This is our culture. This is our religion. What business is it of you Americans whether we circumcise our daughters?" How do we answer her?
Well, that's a very important question. And when Amnesty started working on this several decades ago, it was a question that actually for a while even divided our own membership. People were very afraid that they were being culturally insensitive or even imperialistic in taking this on. I think what makes the difference is hearing the voices of the actual women who experience this and who are fighting against it. Now, then it becomes clear it's not a question, who defines the culture and how does culture change? Culture is not something stagnant. Of course, it's easy for us to say, human rights always trump culture. It's also interesting that these cultural arguments are usually, not always, used to justify cruelty and pain that affect women and not men. I think if men were being cut in this way, somehow the cultural arguments would fade away. But I think it is very important to listen to the women themselves, make their voices heard, because that completely undercuts the argument that this is something being imposed from abroad. It's not. And secondly, I think it is important to take the cultural argument seriously in the sense that to end the practice, one has to really seriously address how you get the whole community to understand that this is something which is not in the interest of the community, not in the interest of the girls they care about, and to take the lead, in fact, in trying to stop it.
Let me, let me sort of follow up on that in the sense that this is something that the West has pushed hard against, really since the 1920s. I think because of British influence, Sudan banned infibulation, which is the worst kind of FGM, back in 1925, and similar period in Kenya. And in fact, it really led in those, especially in those early periods, to something of a backlash. And there was this sense of these outside imperialists telling us what to do, this is our culture. So Anne, if you could maybe talk a little bit about, I mean, is it fair to say that, especially since the 1970s, when there was a ramped up effort, that effort really didn't, that it really was something of a failure? I mean, which is my view, but that now, in the last 10 years or so, we're kind of getting the formula for what works?
Yeah, I think part of the problem is, as you say, that people react to having their cultures, said that they're not right. So, as Nick mentioned, one of the organizations that has been very successful is an organization called TOSTAN, T-O-S-T-A-N, for those of you who want to look it up on the web. It works primarily in West Africa, but also across the band of Africa where this practice is most prevalent. But I think the important thing about it is that it starts at the community level with community discussions. One of the first things that they did was they no longer refer to it as female genital mutilation, because the word mutilation is judgmental, the word cutting is factual. This came about with conversations with the leadership of the communities themselves. I visited the first community that Tostan began in. And they started by talking with the imam, the senior leader. This was a community where men and women were so separated that the women literally had to walk in a different part of the whole community if the men were sitting in the town square. There was absolutely no mixing of men and women. So they began with the imam to talk about the health impacts. And suddenly the lights go on and say, well, yes, I remember my niece went a little crazy after this because of infection. Well, they had never put the health impacts really on the agenda. So then they began to talk about it as a human rights issue. The community now has come together, men and women. Not only has this practice, they've abandoned it as a community, but they've also seen that the education rates have gone up, the access to health care has gone up, better access for women to reproductive health services and attended births. So there's been a lot of impacts of working together as a community. Now, the other thing that they found, again, a cultural aspect, is you couldn't just do it in one community. And so you had to reach out to the other communities, because the question was, if my daughter is not cut, she won't be able to get married because it's a cultural expectation. And so they had to begin to work in groups of communities to really get impact on this practice. Now, there are over 4,000 communities now in Senegal that have abandoned as a result of this community-based approach. And so I think we now know what the formula is that works.
And just to push a little harder, I mean, is it fair to say that the previous campaign, really since the 1970s, these laws passed, conferences held, I was in Guinea last year where FGM is punishable by life imprisonment on the part of the parents, or in some cases, if the girl dies, actually by execution, and yet 99% of Ghanaian girls are still cut. I mean, given the need to learn from mistakes, is it fair to say that that long campaign, until the more community-based approach of Tostan, really is a failure that we should learn from? And I'll toss it out to anybody, whether, I don't mean to subject Anne to this, but I mean, you're welcome to address that, Anne, or anybody else can jump in.
I think this is one of the consequences, is that, people don't want to be told what to do, particularly when they believe it's part of their culture that has been around for generations. On the other hand, one of the countries with the highest prevalence of female genital cutting is Egypt. And they have, particularly with some of the women in the country speaking out themselves, some of the local women, some of the leaders, including the First Lady, speaking out on these issues, they're finding that they can have an impact, particularly as more and more women get access, or more and more families get access to television. So they can address some of these issues on things like soap operas or other ways of communicating with women on television to begin a little bit more dialogue about whether or not this is really something that has to be continued in the culture, or whether or not it can be changed.
And I think as well, Nick, that the absolute importance of a multi-level approach. So the community, grassroots level work is absolutely vital, but unless, as you say, the legislation is there, unless legislation is enforced, unless there's allied advocacy and media campaigns coming in to tell people about the changes in law. Recently, Uganda outlawed FGM, but there's criticism there that government's done very little to actually tell people within Uganda that it's illegal. So you need an approach across the board that is there to reinforce this message.
And Julia, there's a question here that from a YouTube viewer, and I wondered if you could answer it while raising some of the consequences of GF, the practical consequences in terms of health, sexuality, whatever it may be. Mitch from London says, if you could spend 5 minutes with the grandmother of a girl that was about to be cut, presumably the grandmother being, the assumption is the grandmother is a decision maker there. If you could spend 5 minutes with a grandmother of a girl who was about to be cut, what would you say?
You know, the first thing I would do is...
And actually, if maybe let's pretend Mitch didn't say 5 minutes, let's say 1 minute.
Okay, not 5 minutes. Actually, first of all, I'd listen. I'm volunteering in this area, and I know, as Larry was talking about, this charge of cultural imperialism coming in, changing communities. I cannot sit in front of a grandmother and leap in and tell her why this is wrong. But what I can do is talk about health impacts. As Anne said, the causal links between what happens in FGM and then the constant infections, the sepsis, the childbirth complications, everything that results are not known, often because the girls are cut at such a young age, so they don't realize that the impacts that this has. And in fact, many circumcisers are the greatest advocates within their own community to say why this must end once they've seen it.
Larry, you and your organization are obviously focused on human rights, and if has the human rights community been sort of slow to focus on some of these broad issues that involve every home? In other words, if a Sudanese dissident gets arrested by the government, then obviously everybody writes letters. If 3 million girls a year get cut, then, you know, whether it's organizations, whether it's we in the media, everybody, that people kind of tune out.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. We have been too slow, and it's a sort of painful history to have to look at. To understand not only the importance of this issue, but the important general of the rights of women as key, not only to women, but to, in fact, the advancement of all human rights. And it really was the women's movement that pushed the human rights community to begin to understand this. And as it did, our work on all human rights began to improve, because the lessons that you've learned about FGM are lessons that in fact apply to other human rights violations as well, that you have to work with the community, that you have to understand, you have to listen, that you have to empower the people who are there. And you also understand that in this issue, it's not simply a question of this issue separate from the larger issue of violence against women and the larger issue of the devaluation of women, of the discrimination against women. I don't think you can really solve, and TOSTAN certainly took this approach. The reason it adopted a human rights approach was because human rights speak across the board. It's a holistic vision of what people need. It's not just issue-oriented, but it's issued on the basic rights that everyone needs. And when it did that, the community began to understand this not as an isolated cultural practice that everyone condemned, but as part of a general fight for the human rights of everybody in the community. And I think that made a difference. But we have learned a lot, and we need to keep learning. I think now I'm proud to say that certainly my own organization has made the rights of women central to its work on human rights.
And I would just add, you know, where the UN is on the ground dealing with this, whether it's UNICEF or UNFPA, the Population Fund, or UNIFEM, the approach is actually a very holistic one, where they're trying to keep the girls in school and take care of all the other issues that change both the culture of the community and the girl's own aspirations for her life, and in effect empowering her. But the cutting takes place at such an early age. You have to deal with then the mothers and the fathers and the whole community. So the girl doesn't become an advocate for herself until it's too late. I find it interesting that, you know, there's roughly 28 countries in which it's prevalent still. 19 of them have laws against it. It is criminalized in those countries. But that's only half, and even in those countries, we're still fighting this battle. So there is a rule of law problem here that I'm sure you're dealing with as well, that that's not the only answer, obviously. You need these groups in there trying to change the culture at the group level.
And it's also important to point out that it's not a problem that's just confined to Africa. Or I mean, it's now around the world. It's in Europe, it's in the United States. And that even makes it even more complicated to talk about how you're going to stop it.
Well, actually, that goes to a question here. Rob from Luz, which I think is in the UK, asks, You and others have talked about the need to stop FGM within a generation. Do you really think you can do it? Kathy?
Well, there's a goal that the UN has set to eliminate it by 2015, which is the date for the Millennium Development Goals. I don't think there's any reason we shouldn't be trying for that. That's far enough away that we could really do a concerted effort. And frankly, it's going to take a global campaign. You know, and we need a global campaign for girls. This ought to be right front and center at the beginning of it. So I think it's doable.
There may be a parallel with China. Foot binding was actually punishable by exile on the part of the parents, had zero effect. I mean, at various points it was banned, no impact. And then early in the 20th century, really remarkably quickly, it disappeared. And it went from a perception on the part of parents that if they didn't bind their daughter's feet, that it'd be hard for her to marry, to a perception that if they bound her feet, it'd be harder for her to get married. And I guess that the question is...
One emperor changed the rule, changed the perception.
It was really a bottom-up social movement. It led by elites from within the country, part of this sense of awakening, and supported by outsiders to some degree, but really led from within, pushed from within. So I guess the question is how we can replicate that, and whether groups like TOSTAN are indeed, whether this is the next sort of foot binding analogy, so that the change, once it comes, you reach a tipping point, it happens very, very quickly.
I just want to come back to that point Kathy made at 2015. I wish I shared your optimism, Kathy. I just feel that we're here talking about solutions. We seem to know what works. We know this model is there. We know about the respect we have to give to communities. And many, many local NGOs and civil society organizations are working on the ground. And, to pay tribute to all of those small organizations, really at danger as well. One of the women who's contacted me through this campaign, Lucy Mashua, who said, go forth and speak at Davos about this. And her story, once she started speaking out within her community, she was raped, she was beaten, she was tied to a tree, she was jailed. She's luckily living now in the US. But I think what we need to see is how we can, in the next 5 years, if that is true, take this to scale. I'm using the language of Davos there, but really, what is preventing us? If we know how to make things change, why can't we put this into place? Is it a funding issue? Is it a global awareness issue? What needs to happen? What are the levers that we can pull? If we were sitting here saying, actually, this is too intractable, this is too difficult, we're not going to address this issue, fair enough. But we're all sitting here in vehement agreement that this is a severe human rights abuse, a child rights abuse, a women's rights abuse. We've got a solution. What can we do?
A bunch of people on YouTube ask variations of that what have we learned from one person asked what we can learn from HIV campaigns that can be transposed into working to eradicate FGM. Various other people ask, variations of that. And given what you talked about earlier, isn't indeed one lesson perhaps that a bunch of outsiders at the treetops, the top-down efforts on their own aren't going to get very far, and that what does work is outsiders supporting indigenous efforts from within the culture and giving them the microphone and us standing back and letting them lead the way? I mean, is that part of it?
Well, I absolutely think it's part of it. I think that if you can't change the norms, the practices of communities unless you listen and understand and have a dialogue. And again, the TOSTAN approach did exactly that. Listen to the why, listen to the perceptions, and then also gave information about the health effects, the facts. I think that's one of the things that we haven't done enough of as an international community around a number of these issues. And you mentioned HIV/AIDS. One of the most difficult things, we've gotten better coverage of prevention of mother-to-child transmission, of treatment of AIDS generally, of treatment of pediatric AIDS. One of the most difficult things has been to understand really how to have an impact with education. It just hasn't seemed to work, and part of it is I don't think we understand and listen to communities enough. For example, one of the things that you talk about in the Southern Africa, where AIDS is most prevalent, is use of condoms. But there are practices in places like Swaziland where in order to get married, you have to get pregnant first to show your fertility. Well, it's a little difficult to talk about using condoms when you want to get pregnant. And so I think if you don't listen to the community and understand the whys, how the practices work and what's going on truly in the communities, and have a dialogue about it, you can't actually make the change. And I think this human rights approach, engaging the community in human rights, in women's rights, in men and women understanding each other and why things are happening, is a way to really make an impact in changing some of these practices, particularly those that are most harmful for women.
Larry?
If I could just, because I don't want to create a sort of dichotomy between the approach that you just described, which I fully support, and the idea of outside pressure, because that can lead to a kind of paralysis on the part of people who aren't able to have a dialogue with the community. And I think the lesson, not only on this issue, but on many, many other issues, is as Julia said, you need a multi-level or multifaceted kind of approach. Because I think, to take your China example, which is really fascinating, which I want to learn to use more, there was also very, very strong political will on the part of the government that played a major role, I think, as I understand it. At least I'm thinking about,
I think at previous points there was a central political will that actually didn't really get anywhere. And at the time when foot binding really ended up being eradicated, you had very weak central governments that
right. I was thinking
that
it
was
happened
really
after the revolution, but it happened before.
Well, it began happening before in the end of the Qing dynasty, and then after that in a period when you had real social awakening, but pretty fragile central governments.
Well, anyway, my point is that I think we need to put pressure on governments to not simply pass laws, which is the easy thing to do, but to actually not allow the kinds of practices that Julia talked about. I mean, it's, where people are being threatened, people's lives are in danger. You need, the outside world needs to be in support in a very practical way of people who are speaking out and who are being threatened as a result of being speaking out on this issue as well as on other women's rights issues. So I don't think it's an either-or thing. I think that we need very much to correct what I think is a longstanding failure to appreciate the community approach. But I also think we still need to keep general public awareness.
Let me press you on that a little further, since you have a Y chromosome here. And I think there be some men watching, whether here or on YouTube, who will think, hey, this isn't my fight. I don't have a clitoris. And the same thing I think applies to a lot of other women's rights issues. What do you say to them? Is this their fight or not?
Oh, it absolutely is their fight. If they care at all about human rights, about their own freedom and their own dignity. I mean, I think that was my point about the linkage between the fight for women's rights and the fight for all human rights. I mean, it's not, we all can very easily draw the connections between the status of women in any particular society and the general status of human rights in that society. And that includes the societies in which many of the people who are watching this discussion live. Insofar as, and it's the experience of my own life and my own organization, that it was the struggle of women for their rights that made us understand our own rights and the way things are connected, and the way that the approach we were taking was a very narrow and very limited approach. So I think it's in the vital interest of every man. And we, of course, don't live in isolation from women. You know, we have daughters, we have wives, we have lovers, you know, it's inconceivable to me that someone could say this is not of any interest to me because I'm male and this happens to women, any more than I would expect women to say I'm not really interested in what happened to Nelson Mandela because he was a man and I'm a woman. I mean, what kind of world is that where we suddenly divide our feelings about?
Maybe one way of thinking of it is that the Holocaust at the end of the day wasn't a Jewish issue, civil rights weren't a black issue, and FGM isn't just a women's issue.
Right, exactly.
And I think particularly men play such a huge part in the communities that practice this, as Anna said, because one of the key reasons for FGM being in place is it makes a girl marriageable. And when, as part of these community conversations, the men come together and decide that they will marry an uncut woman, this is how it changes within a generation. And you then move to the next community, which is the intramarrying group. So men are so vital in this debate, and particularly as religious leaders as well.
Yeah. And I think when we focus on rights, we get stuck. When we focus on economics, which is really what this all comes down to, is kind of what's a girl worth, and is this about marrying her for her value, it changes. I think because it's girls, people do react differently than women, so I think that's going to help bring more people to the issue. We've used economic incentives in a number of cases to get communities to think differently about early marriage. And the consequence of the man finally having a reason to stop and think about his daughter marrying early or marrying late when there's an economic incentive to do so. And in the case in Ethiopia, a girl who stays in school is eligible for a sheep or a goat for her family if she stays in school 2 more years. The fathers have been saying, I wasn't really in the conversation before. I had no reason to have the conversation. I had no reason to think about it. I had no reason to think about the value my daughter could bring to my family if she stayed in school longer. The economic incentive got him to pay attention. So I'm for the hybrid solution, which is the community listening, incentives where we can apply them. And I know not everybody loves incentives, but I think they do work, and the external pressure. But I think rights sometimes gets people into a different kind of conversation where they have a different view of rights.
Well, speaking of a different kind of conversation, now we've been discussing this at one level, but I want to kind of make it real. And we have a video clip from Mali, and I have not yet seen it. I'm briefed that everybody in the history of the world who's ever seen it has promptly burst into tears afterward. And so pull out your handkerchiefs. But if we can roll that video, that'd be great. Well, that goes on a zillion times a day in much of the world, and I don't know exactly what kind of cutting this was, but it did not appear to be infibulation, which is the much worse kind. And in that case, the girl's legs are afterward often tied together and for a couple of weeks or so the wound can heal, and is that squared. Jane from the UK asks, how can women fight GM in cultures where they have no voice? And likewise, Sam from Devon says, FGM seems to be about what women in some cultures believe they must do and be to have value to the men who hold power. If we're to change the thinking of men and women in these cultures, what can we draw on from our own experience to guide us? And let me frame that to the panel. I mean, I think there's a perception that this is often really about men oppressing women, and it seems to me at least that it's much more complicated than that, and that typically this is what women in fact are doing to other women, that the men, they may want to marry a girl who's cut, but they're largely removed from the decision making, and in fact partly because men are more likely to be educated, it seems quite plausible to me that men are more likely to be against FGM than women are in these countries. I don't know any survey, but that anecdotally, I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case. So I wonder if the problem, isn't often patriarchal values, even misogynistic values that are absorbed and transmitted as much by women as by men. If that isn't a better way of looking at this than men oppressing women.
Well, and the video just showed women are the primary carriers of the culture. I mean, Anne, you've probably, because you've seen it, that is the way it's passed on. You may have a point of view on that, but that's how it is carried in the community.
Well, I think that, certainly that clip showed that it is practiced. When it's actually done, it's women who cut the girls. But yet, it is the men who were saying, my daughter will not be able to get married if she's not cut. So I think it's a practice, it's a culture that has to be addressed as a whole. It's not just women, it's not just men, it's everybody's responsibility to kind of look at how this is going to change. Now, having said that, it is not the same, it's not practiced the same in every country. I went year before last to Sierra Leone. I was reading my briefing papers, and I find out female genital cutting is quite prevalent in Sierra Leone. So I call up Molly Melchin, who founded TOSTAN, and I said, what are you doing in Sierra Leone? She said, we're not, because it's completely different. They practice something called secret societies. And secret societies are where girls would go before there was an education system. They would go off for maybe a few months at a time, and they would learn how to be a wife. They'd learn how to, all of these different things. This was their education. And part of it was they got cut. Now, those secret societies still exist in Sierra Leone, and still a number of young girls get cut, although less and less. And the secret societies are much less about going for a long period of time and more just about cutting now. But one of the things I found when I was there is that young teenage girls who were still in school were talking about these secret societies and these practices as things that they were going to try to help be a part of the past. And so I think there is some ability to engage in some of these kinds of communities. Again, the practices are different. And in that country, it's done in a completely different way. So I think, again, it's about listening, it's about learning about the particular culture and practices of a country and the history of it, I think is key to finding the way to eliminate it.
Speaking of culture and practices, one other layer of complexity here is, frankly, religion. That there, and I want to be very great part of the Muslim world does not practice cutting. There's nothing in the Quran about cutting. In the Arabian Peninsula, almost nobody does any cutting. And there are also a number of Christian places, Ethiopia in particular, that, in fact, in Ethiopia, Christians do some of the most severe cutting. All that said, most of the cutting occurs in Muslim countries, whether that is in Africa or in Asia. And doesn't that, I mean, given the problems right now between the West and the Muslim world, doesn't that create one more layer of complexity if you have Western efforts to go against a practice that is disproportionately embedded in the Muslim world? And I don't know who I want to hand this nice this potato to, but pass it on.
Can I
how Larry does it, 'cause you must have to face that a lot.
Can I turn it around and just say Mauritania has just issued a fatwa against FGM. 34 Islamic leaders have actually just said that this is, as you say, absolutely not in the Quran and not an issue. I hate to address the positives in the debate, but you know, that there is change, and at least if we know that this is one of the key issues, at least we can begin to address it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's changed also that we need to not keep acting as if it hasn't changed is that, you know, human rights issues at least are no longer a concern of the West somehow. The human rights movement is no longer located in the West. It's everywhere. There are human rights organizations, there are thousands of human rights organizations in virtually every region, and in the Muslim world there are incredible organizations and fighters for human rights. And I think what has to shift is that we need to see, and this is something that my organization has to struggle with, is how do we shift our role from being sort of, you know, the saviors of the world, that savior paradigm, to a role of like really empowering and trying to help and listen to those organizations in those cultures who are fighting. There is an incredible struggle, which we often don't publicize very much, we don't write about it very much, we act as if it's not there, within Islam, within the Muslim world, on these issues, on what it means. And that's the struggle, I think, which is ultimately going to determine the success for the reasons we gave about when human rights succeed, it's because they're rooted in the indigenous struggle in the culture. And that's what I think is the hope for this, that it's becoming a global issue, not a Western issue, being imposed on the part of the world that carries it out, which was the model decades ago.
Marion from Germany asks, what do you think should be the punishment levied by the international community for nations that permit FGM? Now, my hunch is that probably none of you think that countries as such should be punished, but why not? I mean, are there levers that we can apply to countries to take this issue more seriously, or would that create a backlash that would be unhelpful?
It's already there in the Maputo Protocol, which has been signed up to by many African states, but not yet ratified. So absolutely, we have a role to play as an international community to get some of these issues enshrined in law. And, you know, we had a conversation about CEDAW, the elimination of the Commission for the Elimination Against Discrimination Against Women, trips off the tongue. You know, and all of these levers do play an important part, I think, and we need to keep the pressure up to ensure that they're ratified.
CEDAW has been, of course, passed by, I don't know, 100 and I don't know how many countries, and one of the very few that has not passed it is the U.S. Let me open this up more broadly. There are folks here. We have a microphone.
Hi, I'm Michelle from San Francisco, and I'm one of the many volunteers with V-Day, and I'm also in a doctoral program in international human rights education in San Francisco. So I wrote a paper last year on FGM, and in the literature I noticed that one of the reasons why the women are continuing the cutting is because it's their means of economic sustainability. So I was wondering, given that it's the economic forum, what public-private sector partnerships have been built in, if there are any subsidies that governments might be giving to women to help them transition from this profession, and what else we can do as civil society actors to help move that forward, and also in terms of leveraging some of the new media technologies like Kiva.org and Women for Women International and Donors Choose, like what we can do to help move that forward.
You know, we've been trying to move the issue of girls actually up on the agenda of Davos and have been fairly successful. Had a very good session yesterday about girls and trying to look at the actors, government, nonprofits, and business, and there's a role for each. We've actually just created a girl fund to help support with private sector money as well as government money, work in communities to give girls more rights, keep them in school, give them access to health and freedom from sexual violence or some of these other causes. So I think increasingly, if we get more players who are educated about this and are engaged in it, the money does talk, and you know, that will be an important piece of changing the way the culture works. And I mean, to what Julia said earlier, I think the communities need to see that this is part and parcel of what it will take for them to grow and to become a modern area. So I absolutely think you're right that we've got to make this a part of the work that all of the communities are doing. So when the U.S. puts money into these communities, this is one of the things they're checking for.
I would just also add that not in Senegal, but in most other places, the person who does the cutting is the traditional birth attendant, the traditional midwife. And there has to be a much broader effort to address maternal health. I mean, there's this, it's a scandal that more than 500,000 women die a year in childbirth unnecessarily, and partly that is because there has been a broad and essentially failed effort to improve maternal health through traditional birth attendants. It did not work, and now I think we're all realizing that. But as we gear up a newer system to improve maternal health based on people who actually have much better training, who can refer to hospitals, who bring people to clinics, real midwives, then I think it's plausible that those people will then have influence in those communities over reproductive health, and it will go away from these traditional, these Daya, who are the ones who were doing the cutting.
You know, what I find quite shocking about the FGM arena is the fact that 140 million women are living with the consequence of FGM, and they appear to be missing from things like the maternal mortality debate, from the child death, all of the MDGs that this addresses, and the continuum of care that is needed for these women in particular. And yet there's so much happening within this field, and everywhere I look, FGM always seems to be missing. And I think exactly as you say, all of these instruments can come into play. And in a way, what we need to do is to be focusing on a plethora of solutions that can help bring this back into the mainstream, really.
If I might just pick up on the whole issue of maternal health and these issues. You know, we had a little film about Mali and the prevalence of female genital cutting in Mali. But in many of these countries, there's also a very high incidence, along with female genital cutting, of early marriage. And the two issues combined, we know that the risks to maternal health are greater with women who have been cut. We also know that a girl who is under the age of 15 who gives birth has a 5 times greater chance of dying in childbirth. And so Mali was my last field trip, as a matter of fact, just in November, and I had very interesting conversations with the health minister about his responsibility to address the issues of early marriage and female genital cutting, because they truly are issues with health consequences to women and affect the maternal health and mortality issues.
I mean, Kathy, let me just follow up on that. Given the success of this grassroots kind of toe stand model of education, discussion leading to addressing FGM, can that same model then be applied to the whole panoply of other issues of keeping girls from dropping out of school, preventing child marriage, various reproductive health questions, including family planning? I mean, is this bottom-up grassroots supporting local actors model, is that something that can be used against a whole variety of other threats to the well-being of girls around the world.
Oh, I mean, I think that's the only way it can happen. I think when we've tried to do things like let's just focus on education or just focus on health, we're not nearly successful because we're not dealing with the underlying issue of the girl's value. So if you put them all together, economic empowerment, education, health, especially the access to this kind of health care and reproductive rights, then you're really dealing with a whole change mechanism that can make a big difference. But it really has to be that. And luckily, the UN has a 5-point approach to girls, and that's the way they do it. And I think increasingly we will all adopt that kind of a holistic, to your word, holistic approach.
Ron Freeman, Troika Dialogue, Moscow. Madam Lalla-Maharjh mentioned in Mauritania a collective fatwa against FGM. I wonder if we could get a few more facts about what led to that and whether it has any mileage, so to speak.
Yeah.
I do know that there has been a real effort by some of the community organizers to get Muslim clerics organized in this effort, because there is a perception on the part of many ordinary people that this is religious, that this is their religion. And so when you get imams saying, no, they don't do this in Saudi Arabia, they do nothing in the Quran, that actually has a tremendous amount of authority. And so that has been one reason for trying to get these fatwas.
Sarras, for young global leader, and actually I come from the Muslim world. And this is why I wanted to interfere and to give the comment. In fact, something like this is totally prohibited in the Muslim world. And just to rephrase Christoph's question, I would assume it's more culturally than it's religiously. So this is more actually, instead of saying that it's Islam. So that's the first layer to really acknowledge it. And I really respect the Venom Man by mentioning that the First Lady in Egypt stood out and acknowledged that this is totally against our, let's say, or their traditions, the religion, and all the, let's say, the social intrinsic values that we were raised up through. Now, unfortunately, it's my own analysis. It's only a comment, so allow me to take some time.
Please
just wanted to raise this. No, there's no question. Just wanted to clarify that. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm Jim Breyer. I'm a venture capitalist with Accel Partners in Palo Alto, and I've been on the board of Facebook, an investor in Facebook for about 5 years.
What's your next investment?
Well, we have about a dozen investments in social media companies around the world. And Julia, and for any other panelists that might be interested, what can we as either business investors or part of the business community around social media do better to further many of these causes that we've talked about today?
I'm going to talk to you afterwards one-on-one because I need your advice. I mean, absolutely. I was talking with someone just the other day about how he uses mobile phones to get medicines into villages and able to predict supply and demand in a much, much clearer way. And having been out in Africa, knowing the growing use of that sort of technology is absolutely crucial. I mean, imagine if this network of, as we said before, taking things to scale, imagine if we can do that through empowering community leaders to, even if it's someone saying, I know that there's a cutting ceremony that's due to take place within 2 months. And then being able to gear up around that. I think there's so much that can be done. And the empowerment around that is huge. But also what I found through my experience is how many people have contacted me globally. So this is not just about what the West can do. I had so many emails from people in Cameroon, in Guinea, in all sorts of places saying, what can I do in my own community? And one thought is just about, there's not one database, for example, that someone contacted me from Guinea-Bissau to say, can I download from the web? I'm about to teach this class. What can I download from the web? I couldn't find a single place where that person could just go to be able to say to their community, these are the issues that you could deal with. So we need to hit this straight on.
Let me just add something there. vis-a-vis what Julia has done. I mean, that frankly, one of the problems is that we in the news media tend to drop the ball on these kinds of issues. That what we do, we tend to cover what happened yesterday. We tend not to cover what happens every day. And whether it's public health issues, whether it's this kind of daily human rights abuse, it just falls through the cracks. And since we in the media tend to be the ones who help shape the agenda, and since we drop the ball on these kinds of issues, that leaves it, frankly, to people like Julia to bring it up on the agenda. And I really salute you for having done that at Davos. And I think that that is a model for a whole range of other issues, whether it's malaria or anything else. That this is our greatest weakness. We are not good at covering things that happen every day. We blow it on those issues, and you've got to raise those and poke us and kind of hold our feet to the fire so that we actually do a better job of covering these incredibly important issues that are ongoing and part of the backdrop and get ignored as a result.
If I might just talk a little bit about, you talked about the use of cell phones for everything from monitoring nutrition to health, and UNICEF's doing a lot of this work. But we also support TOSTAN extensively. And one of the ideas of TOSTAN has been that these communities that have become TOSTAN communities, eliminating the practice through this community-based approach, suddenly they begin to see cell phones in these communities, particularly owned by women. And yet most of the women are illiterate. So they've now started in some of the TOSTAN communities a texting for literacy program, where they're teaching women how to read because it's so much cheaper to text than talk in Africa, unlike the US. And so I would challenge the tech community to say, how do we take the next leap forward, recognizing that many of these communities that practice these cultures are now into the cell community as well.
Yeah, my name is Richard. I run an international NGO that works on aging in the developing world. And firstly, I opt my NGO and our partners over 70 countries to play a role. Older people in many of the countries are connected to this particular practice, and maybe we can actually do something constructive, and maybe a coalition needs to be built. But I think one of the most striking things for me is about voice. I mean, it is important. I can't remember the name of the Somali model that wrote her autobiography about her life. But I think the more that happens, the more that voice can be heard at the national level, and that actually women who have had to bear this are able to have the courage to speak. And using Facebook, that maybe there are ways to enable voice to be heard. I think that will be transformational, and I don't quite know how we do that, but it's maybe a useful strategy.
Hello, I'm from Switzerland, Isabel Schau. And I just wanted to ask, what kind of programs do we have to empower mothers who have been cut? They say they need to do it for their daughters, but how can we empower them to educate their sons not to marry a cut girl? Because then if the expectation is not there anymore, maybe the girls won't undergo this.
Part of the model that we're all saying TOSTAN, in fact, a number of local civil society organizations are also implementing this model. Part of that is that as well as having conversations with the women, you of course have conversations with the men. And of course mothers are talking with their sons as part of this, but the whole community is coming together. So the hope is that everyone all at once does come to a shift in awareness about the practice.
Thank you. Mina Al-Arabi. I work with the Sharq Al-Awsat newspaper, and I'm also a young global leader. I just wanted to ask you, in terms of getting spokespeople from communities that have given up female genital mutilation to go to communities that haven't yet. I mean, I'm sure you've had some experience of this, but if we can take that to a greater scale, if there's funding for such projects to facilitate their travel, because I think that's the best way to get the message out, to say that we used to do it and we've given up and these are the benefits, is probably the best person with credibility, because often with these issues, it's about credibility. And I think it's wonderful have you raised that this is not an issue for Muslims or that Islam is the one calling for this. And I think that breaks away the taboo, because if you tell Muslims, and I am one of them, that this is not to say that just because you're a Muslim, we think that you're a bad person doing this. On the contrary, there is an appreciation that this is not something that the Quran dictates, but sadly there are those that twist the religion on so many different levels. So I salute the way you've approached it.
I know that when people, have been making this point, the fact that Saudi Arabia does not, that there is not cutting in Saudi Arabia, that is one of the things that is always emphasized, and one of the things that has the greatest, surprise to people, has the greatest authority. I don't know of any cases, I don't know if anybody else does, of, people, envoys being sent, clerics from Saudi Arabia, for example, to communities in these countries to say, you've got it wrong. But I mean, in fact, in my experience, invariably in every country, there are voices from within that country who are saying this is ridiculous. This is not, and so, and to the extent that those people speak the language and have local credibility and authority.
Sorry, very, very quickly, but just, the communities that did used to practice it. That's what I mean, like you mentioned in Senegal or Mauritania, where there's a community that it was, recently actually practiced and then given up, because I think that's the most credible voice.
No, very good point. I want to now kind of wind up, and for those who didn't get a chance to ask your questions, feel free to mob the folks here afterward. But we've been talking about something that happens 3 million girls a year. Human rights violation, I think we agree, on a vast scale, leads to more maternal mortality, leads to more girls dying of infection, at a scale, we don't really know. When a girl dies after she's been cut, people just say, oh, she died of malaria. People don't acknowledge how often this happens. But what do we do? Somebody is here, wants to get involved, somebody's watching on YouTube. They can go to the TOSTAN website, which is tostan.org, TOSTAN.org, learn more about it in that way. They can go to Julia's website, and I don't know, I'm sure.
Which is endfgmnow.org. But also another excellent website is forwarduk.org.uk. which is where I volunteer as well.
Well, let's go systematically through here. Maybe Kathy, if you can start. And what does somebody do?
Yeah. Well, I think it's awesome that that the YouTube community chose this issue and already has stood up for it. So having a voice is the first thing. The second is to become an advocate for girls. If you haven't seen the Girl Effect video, which is on YouTube, it's an awesome thing, and I think it gives you the sense of the positive, that if you can become an advocate for girls, we can end some of these troublesome things. I think you had a great idea, which is instead of shame and blame, we ought to be finding those who've already begun to fight back. And, we all probably need to do a better job of thanking Uganda for just making the thing against the law right now. So I think we all have voices, and we should be using them more, and we've got the tools now.
Well, first of all, I think it's clear to everybody that this is part of a larger struggle for women's rights in general. And I think, and I'm happy to be agreeing with Nick on this, that this is a particular moment in history where this battle really is ripe. There can be a sea change in the world. I think FGM is part of that issue. I don't think it's the only one, but it's a continuum of how we raise the status of women and how we just make intolerable practices that have seemed tolerable. So that's the first thing. And there's myriad ways for people to get involved. And it's not only a question of the West against the developing world, it's also a question of the fight within each country where these issues are still involved. So I think that's the first thing. And the second thing is that Amnesty is involved right now in a campaign in Europe to try to change the practices and policies of the European Union to make sure that they're supporting the kind of approaches that we've talked about here. It's very easy for people to get involved in that. They can Google their local Amnesty website for whatever country they're in, and also to make sure that women who are trying to get refuge in this country or in countries in Europe because they have a legitimate fear of being forced to be cut, that the laws are changed to make that possible for them to do.
And Julia, in case anybody doesn't have your website down yet.
clearly the website. But what I really think we need to do is make FGM much more explicit. The data, the paucity of the data is shocking. There is a lot that's out there, but how can we ascertain the global scale of this issue if we don't actually know what we're dealing with? The 3 million figure we're all quoting is in Africa alone. It doesn't tackle Indonesia, Yemen, UAE. It doesn't tackle Europe, where we know 500,000 women are living with FGM. So we don't understand the scale. We don't understand what needs to be done on a country-by-country basis to tackle the problem. A solution in Indonesia is completely different to what we need in Cameroon, in Sierra Leone, as Anna said, as in Senegal. We need to be very, very cognizant of what is the global action plan. Without that, we can't cost a solution. If this is a matter of resources, then great, let's just get on and fundraise. But until we are much more aware about the global scale of this problem and what needs to be done about it, we can't reach that target of 2015. I think very kind offer from an NGO already working in this field. Thank you, I'll be in touch. But equally, all the NGOs working in this area, please get FGM on your agenda. Do something more about it. And I've run out of steam. Go to my website. There are 5 easy things that you can do there. They may seem little things. But lastly, do what you can. This is going out to the YouTube community. There'll be people watching all over the world. I chose to enter a competition on Davos. You may want to find out what is happening in your local community. You may wish to fundraise. You may wish to push your government on various things or your MP. Know what your action is and what your agency is, and please just do something. It's International FGM Day, International Anti-FGM Day on the 6th of February. That's a week today. Contact a journalist. Talk about FGM. Thank you.
Don't feel free to contact, don't feel you have to contact this journalist in particular. I'm already on board. Anne?
Well, certainly I would agree with all that's been said, but I think it's, first of all, so important to recognize that this is first and foremost a violation of the rights of the girl child. Think about the fact that most of the people, the children who are subjected to this, are between about the ages of 4 and maybe 12. I mean, this is a human being that really doesn't have the right to say no. It's imposed on her. The second thing I would say is that everyone should look at those organizations that are working in this arena. It isn't a popular cause. These organizations can't generate lots of resources for their work, and so support those organizations that are truly making a difference in this area.
Let me just also say finally that this is indeed just part of a broader puzzle, and that quite aside from the simple moral issue, it's an eminently practical issue that we're not going to make progress against global poverty, against insecurity, unless girls are brought into the picture, brought into the formal economy, educated, and so on. This is one facet of that larger picture. And then we really hope that you, whether you're right here or watching on YouTube, will get engaged. And I think Julia really deserves our thanks and appreciation for bringing this issue to Davos and to YouTube, to the Davos Debate. And please join me in thanking her and all the panelists here today.